like you said, schooling is only one form, but I'd really like to kind of look a little bit at schooling because, this is really relevant in my life right now. Got two little ones, and me and my wife have been kind of going back and forth about what we want to do with them. And actually, one of my wife's friends works in a public school. We're in New York, and she sent her a bunch of texts, which I think summarize the situation in many schools fairly well. And what she writes is also very representative of my own experience in school. So I just want to kind of read some of this and then.
Nice. These are text from an actual teacher in the New York schools.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she's I think she might be a counselor, but she works. Yeah, she works in this. Yeah, so I thought this would be like a cool thing to share, and this is just, I didn't edit it or anything, so this is just exactly what she wrote. So she writes, public schools are designed to create worker bees who do what they're told when they're told and are too afraid to ask questions, think for themselves, and think outside the box. It is a one-size-fits-all model that isn't designed to differentiate or take into consideration the individual needs of the child. If you cannot comply and conform, you're referred for special education. There are some lucky children who end up in a class with a teacher who truly loves what she does and will go above and beyond and do that little bit of extra to make the lesson special or unique. But generally, they follow, in her words, a cut and dry as fuck curriculum that teaches them to do math this way and picks the books that the kids will read and what they will write and about how that writing will look. The class sizes of 22 plus children, unless you're in special ed, and typically one teacher, unless once again you're lucky to be in a class with two, doesn't allow for any individualized attention or approach. Forget about it if your child needs anything special, anything like movement breaks, a moment to stretch, or they cannot sit for a 47-minute period. Some at age 4.7, because that's when K starts for December babies. You will either be deemed a problem, get calls every day, or be referred for special ed. Teachers don't have the time or energy to differentiate. They have 22 kids, and their effectiveness and their grade depends on the progress and grades of the kids, which in her words again is a crock of shit. They need to be able to show measurable data progress. Otherwise, it's not enough. They do not leave room for creativity, imagination, and hands-on learning. If you're a school that's Title I and are lucky enough to have funding for arts and crafts or dance, then you get that once a week. STEAM is a joke in most schools. That's some kind of special program from my understanding. Lunch is 25 minutes, and outdoor play or indoor movie is another 25. And that's all the socializing that is allowed for the day, really. And there's a ton of other things, such as lack of parent involvement. No one really truly cares about what parents think, want, or need for their child. Some teachers will extend the invite to collaborate, but the administration and higher-ups don't want this too much, so there's a lot of hoops to jump through. Whoever came up with the curriculum doesn't have any clue of child development and what their brains are capable of doing at what age, because the way that the children are expected to attend and be these little robots of work is really disheartening. There's very little ability to socialize in the actual classroom. The projects that are assigned, in my opinion, should be done in school as a class or in small groups instead of being done at home by the parents. And then the children are the ones getting a grade or praise for a beautiful project that is displayed when you can clearly tell a parent did it. The grading policy is a whole nother joke. Extremely boring texts and books that the children are expected to engage in. And if they do not or cannot, then they are deemed below grade level and can be at risk of holdover. The texts aren't reflective of the actual knowledge and doesn't often test any real abilities such as critical thinking, creativity, or problem solving. So can you reflect, add, or expand on any of this? And how does this land with you?
Wow. I mean, it rings true. It rings true. This is a report from the trenches, as it were. This is not theoretical. This is not a hypothesis. And it echoes the things that I've been hearing from teachers in most public schools throughout the country for as long as I've been working in the field. There's, of course, many things to say about it. One thing to say about it is that it wasn't always the case that the large public schools built by nation states were as dysfunctional as they are now. That there was a time historically when these things were actually amazing innovations that changed the world for the better. So it's important to get that we're not looking at something that was a huge mistake from the beginning. We're looking at something that was actually an incredible innovation, which time has passed, basically, of being effective as what it's trying to be. And this happens with many forms of social systems, that they're appropriate for a time. They pass the time at which they're appropriate, and then they start to become counterproductive to the thing they're actually trying to do. That the schools are now anti-educational, that the schools are making us stupid, right? That the money is making us poor, that the medicine is making us sick, right? Like the institutions start to have kickback effects when they've become so complex and bureaucratized, and they become their own unit, and they seek to reproduce themselves irrespective of the effect they're having on the rest of the society and the people within them. So the schools become an end to themselves. The schools seek to perpetuate being schools the way we've known them. And so that's just the first thing I want to mention, is that this is a situation where we need to kind of look at the long arc of history and think about, especially the American public schools, as at certain points in history being incredibly good things. And then crossing a threshold, especially in the past, let's say 2-3 decades, with the emergence of digital, when they've actually become obsolete, and and we don't know how to take them apart and make something new. So it's also worth mentioning that there have been many, many innovations in schooling as well during these past 30 years, and that it's very difficult to, for example, generalize that statement about schools to all schools in the US, because all schools in the US, especially since the pandemic, have become radically different from one another. So like more so than ever in the United States, I'm just speaking about the United States, if you took a random kid out of the school system and then another random kid out of the school system, like 5 random, like their experiences would likely be so fundamentally different from one another. So fundamentally different. We have small private schools and charter schools that are giving certain students literally historically unprecedented educational opportunity, like crazy, like you're talking to NASA scientists in the space station on Zoom with like tons of resources and like lots of individual attention. So like this is happening. There's pockets of crazy good stuff happening. And then we've got other places in the school system that are just inhumane. Like literally, these are inhumane places to be keeping young people. And so that's another thing I'll note, which is that one of the things that has started to characterize the system in the States is an increasing stratification, which mirrors the increasing economic stratification, but it's an increasing stratification of access and diversification of access to educational goods, which is setting up a much more inequitable system. So that's worth noting too, is that some people will hear this and they're fortunate enough to have their kids in a school that actually doesn't do this stuff. And they're thinking, well, that's not my experience. Well, it's not. But for plenty of people, this is the main experience. So that's another thing I'll say. I think the thing that stands out most from this is something that I write about in my book, which is the tendency to take what is a social or political issue or an institutional issue, and instead of locating the issue at the level of the institution or the level of the social structure, you locate the problem in the individual themselves, right? So when you're looking at a kid who doesn't perform well in school, you can ask a bunch of questions about why they're not performing well, right? You could ask questions about the nature of the physical environment they're in, their nutrition, the culture of the school, the nature of the teaching that's being done, the developmentally appropriateness of the curriculum, those kinds of things, right? Which all deflect accountability for the student's performance away from the student and towards the situation the student's in, right? Well, it's not actually your fault, kid. It's the fault of the school. It's the fault of the teacher. It's the fault of whatever, right? That tends to not be what we do. It tends to be the case that we think that stuff's all set. The school's fine. The curriculum's great. You've got teachers. You're being fed. Like, the problem's you, kid. The problem's your brain, actually. Your problem is your genetics. You've got a biological problem that stops you from focusing and learning. We're going to put you on drugs, right? And so you've gone all the way from questioning the school and the school structure to locating a social and political problem in the child's brain, in their biological substrate. And so you've medicalized academic underperformance. And to medicalize academic underperformance is to depoliticize academic underperformance. And it's very important to get, which is that, schooling is not a technical thing. Schooling is a political, social, ethical thing, which means that if there's a problem with what's taking place, it's a political, social, ethical problem. It's not a biological problem with the kid's brain. If you turn a social, political problem into a biological problem, you've just medicalized deviance. Basically, if you medicalize political deviance, which we also do in political discourse, I disagree with this person's political views, they're crazy. Like there's something wrong with their brain because I disagree with their political views. You're like, whoa. Like, should we send political dissidents to psychiatric hospitals? Because this is what they used to do in Russia, right? The fact that you politically disagree means that actually it's a biological issue. It's fundamentally, it's your physiology, not a legitimate political disagreement, right? And so similarly with young children, to the extent that we load them with a social problem and then we medicalize that problem, characterize them as somehow basically broken biologically, that they can't fit into this system, we've just depoliticized the whole issue. Because now we can't ask questions about, hey, maybe the school's not set up right. Like maybe you haven't given the kid a reason to learn because he's actually sophisticated enough to see through all of this bullshit. Instead, what you've done is tell him that for the rest of his life, he's got to deal with a biological dysfunction that's, makes it impossible for him to learn. And so that's just a very, very slippery slope, which we are way, way far down on, which is deflecting criticism from the socio-ethical political environment of the school and putting criticism in medical terms and directing it at the child's brain. And the child's the most vulnerable one in the whole world. Children are the most vulnerable ones. They just are. And so that's something I'll note. And she notes that in these texts, right? That it's just like, listen, if your kid can't do what we're trying to get them to do in school, don't question the school. Yeah, right. Like question your kid's brain, basically. blame the brain instead of blaming the school. So it's a sign that an institution is radically resistant to change, when precisely those things which should be taken as evidence that it should change are characterized in terms that make it impossible to even have that argument about change. Right. And so this is a deep issue. And so I've pushed back a lot against the medicalization of academic underperformance. That's one bit that I'll raise. And then another thing I'll reflect on is that, the system of education that she's describing, I would describe it like high modernist education, like where we took the factory model, like literally took the factory model, like grades, like A, B, C, D, those grades literally came from the factory model. And it was an innovation that was done at Mount Holyoke College, specifically the first place to ever give grades. And it was literally taken from an administrator who had worked in factories where they were grading the output of meat and things of that nature. So like grade A meat, right? We know that as a term. Grade A is grade A, right? FDA, grade A, or whatever it is. So literally we took the notion of grading materials from the factory, brought them into the classroom. The regimentation, the one-size-fits-allness, all of that comes from kind of high modernist theory of large-scale public schooling. And that has been changed often. You will also find what I will call like late modernist or postmodernist forms of schooling, which attempt to do away with all of that stuff. No grades, no classes, like that kind of stuff. Like let the kid do whatever they want. Like these notions, make a small little charter school, that's not preparing kids to go to a factory. That's preparing kids to go to like a tech startup, right? So like you take a big high school, you break it into a bunch of small high schools. In the small high schools, you get all this other stuff going on, diversity, inclusion, culture, like anti-racism, like all of this stuff starts to come through these postmodern schools, which are just an augmentation or a reaction against the high modernist schools, and themselves end up reproducing a lot of similar problems. So that's worth noting. So what I'm proposing in my book is basically the end of schools, so full stop. Like just let's end these things. Because by the way, we haven't always had schools. Like it's been a small historical slice of time. If you look at the whole arc of human history, and we don't even know how long it is, right? We're talking like 700,000 years, like that kind of like deep history. We've not had schools for like a minute, and there have been things that looked like schools, but education was much more distributed throughout the entire culture and largely in the family and in the religious context. So the idea that we could have a society where these things that we think of as schools are basically don't exist anymore, and yet we have a more profoundly effective and meaningful educational system that has ever existed. So I talk about the end of schools, the decline of schools, the obsoleting of schools in the context of an educational renaissance. That in fact, moving into an educational renaissance will require us fundamentally rethinking schooling. And so I propose this thing called the decentralized educational hub network, which we could talk about if you want to, but it's not a school. It's a fundamentally new kind of emergent institution that becomes part of an educational system, which doesn't rely on schools primarily, that brings educational responsibility back into the community, into the family, and makes a tremendous number of resources available in an efficient way to allow for a kind of radical customization and individualization of curriculum. Like, so for example, one thing she doesn't know, but which is in the culture of the schools, is the age segregation of classes. Age segregation of classes, like, again, from the factory, super weird, like sociologically, historically, like bizarre. Like we do that in our society. We age segregate the old people, keep the old people up in some place away from us, and we age segregate the young people. And then among the young people, we only let them hang out with people who are own age, like very precisely, like which is insane. It's like completely insane from a social cultural perspective, like unprecedented historically. It's not that young people didn't hang out with young people, but there was a ton of intergenerational mingling. Like when you were 13, if you were in certain contexts, you were a man and you were running the farm. Like you know what I mean? You were dealing with adults. And in the one-room schoolhouse of early America, it was all the ages were in the one room, right? And the older kids taught the younger kids, right? And so that's an example where it's just like, we could do away with that completely. Like in the educational hub network, as I imagine it, you are grouped into pop-up classrooms, not by virtue of the age you are, but by virtue of your interest and skill capacity and other things of that nature. And you actually want to organize relationships where the older students who are more capacitated teach the younger students who are less capacitated. One of the best ways to learn things is to actually teach them. And we take away the opportunity from children to feel that they are teachers, to feel that they are contributors to society, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that begin to look radically different from the perspective of childhood socialization that could be easily made possible if we just kind of get rid of these structures that we've inherited, that are like almost a century old now, some of these structures that we're running schools on. And the age segregated classrooms is one of those. And it's related to just the function of schools as a means of keeping children out of the job market. And this will be the place where I end, which is that you can't separate the history of schooling from the history of capitalism. And there's a whole like long other thing to say about that, which I'll skip. But one of the main things there is just that we keep children out of any position where they could actually do real work that would help their society. Like, like that. And if we think about why there's like a youth mental health crisis, this is one of the reasons, is that you become a teenager, you look out at the world, you see all these problems, and yet you are put in a context of school where none of the work you're doing in school contributes to those problems, period. Like, by David Graeber's definition, he was a great anthropologist, school is a bullshit job. It's a bullshit job. And what that means is that, like, you're doing work, you're working your ass off, but the only person, the work you're doing doesn't contribute to anyone else's work. It's basically, you don't have to do that work. The world does not need your work. Schoolwork is something you do to get grades, to then go to the next school, to then get grades, to go to college, to then go to the next school out of college. And then maybe after you graduate college, then you'll be able to contribute to society. Right? And so what that means is that kids feel like they're worthless. Like there are a ton of problems in the world which they would like to work on, which they can't work on. And they're actually kept out of meaningful experiences of actual work for most of their lives, which means by the time they get to work, they don't even know what it means to, like, do work. All they know is how to do bullshit jobs. And she kind of mentions that when she says they're just being prepared to be little automatons. And the automaton doesn't question whether the work is meaningful. They just do it because they're told to do it. But actual work, is meaningful. Like, I do this, and if I don't do this, I can't give it to you. And if I can't give it to you, then you can't do what you need to do. And then somebody doesn't get fed. Right? That's work. And so we've actually arranged the system where we keep children out of touch with work intentionally and put them in a position not to be able to contribute to the problem solving in the society that they live in. So part of the Educational Hub Network is to almost resuscitate a kind of guild model where the kids are brought in at a young age into collaboration with experts in the context of solving actual problems that need to be solved, not made up problems that we ask the kid to solve because it's on the exam. Actual problems that need to be solved. Like, God forbid, we get these kids to do things that actually make them feel like they are capable, like, member of their society, contributing to their society. And this is one of the reasons we kind of like, and you resent children. Like, it's hard to say this, but because they're perceived as an economic burden. Basically, the children are perceived as free riders, right? Free riders on the work that we're all doing for a productive society. Then we've got these kids, and the kids can't do productive work, and so we don't really value them, and we kind of resent them, and we think about them in terms of cost-benefit analysis and how much am I investing in this kid, and how much will I get back when he finally succeeds. And so we're very confused in our thinking about children, in part because we've forced them into lives that are not serious. We've forced them into trivial bullshit work when many of them are ready to be quite serious by the time they're 12 or 13, and if not earlier. And again, most prior human cultures had that, like, I'd like to say that people who are about 30 years old now are probably about as mature as 15-year-olds from most cultures that have ever existed on the earth. Because, most cultures would existed on the earth by the time you're 15, you've been in a room where someone has died. You literally watched someone die, maybe even cleaned up the bed after they've died. You have been responsible for your younger siblings in a way that is not contrived. That's very fundamental. You've been contributing to the economic productivity of the culture that you're in, sometimes filling essential roles as a 12 or 13-year-old in the society. And so I'm not saying let's do away with child labor laws, right? Because in capitalism, like, we need laws to protect the youth. And that's another conversation about how we're failing there as well. But I am saying that we're creating a kind of immaturity. We are creating a kind of immaturity, and then we're shocked when they're all so immature. But it's kind of like, what do you expect? You've given them nothing serious to do for most of their lives, and now you expect them to just be mature and serious? Like, no. Like, where can they be challenged? Where can they learn to fail? Where can they confront death and birth and reality? Not in school. So So those are just some more reflections there to kind of deepen that. But that was some powerful text. It was good to get something, because I'm not a teacher. I'm not in the trenches. So it's good to get just that data from the trenches to bounce off of. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table.
Yeah. I just wonder how this is hitting for people that are going to be listening to this. But for me, it's just impact, like what you said and just what she said. And then what you said is just like amplifying and really impacting me. And there's so many pieces there from, not taking responsibility and blaming the child. Something's wrong with the child. Literally yesterday, my wife was sharing her friend's kid got a report card. He's 4 years old. He got a report card and he's being graded on all these things. He's in preschool and the teacher's saying, oh, he needs to open up more. And then she's saying something about, oh, he doesn't know how to spell his name. And the teacher misspelled his actual name. And my wife's friend's like, how do you expect him to know how to spell his name? You don't even know how to spell it. And then, yeah, there's just so many pieces there. Just like hearing you talk, I'm just thinking about my own experience and how I would relate to people that were older. And there was this kind of anxiety of like, oh, they're so much out there. They're so much older. I can't talk to them. It's like an authority thing. And me and my wife were just talking about that. And it's so clear that that's what I was conditioned to do. And like with this age thing, like you could only be around people your age. You can't be with anybody that's older. So yeah, there's so much that comes up.